So yeah, thanks again everyone for joining this webinar. As I said, my name's Nick. I'm Director of Policy and Insight at Power to Change. And today we're discussing the findings of new research on the economic contribution of community business. We are joined by a great panel of speakers to help us kind of work through that research. My colleague Linda Hien is Insight Manager at Power to Change and has been managing lots of this work from Power to Change's side. We have Andrew and Andy, both directors of Autus Economic Research, who led on the research for us, and Stephen Miller, who's an independent consultant working with Autus Economics on the work, and Stephen also formerly of the Power to Change parish. So really nice to see Stephen again. The structure for today's event is loosely as follows. So I'll kick us off in a couple of minutes, just talking through the kind of rationale for the research from Power to Change's perspective. And then I'll pass to Andrew, Andy, and Stephen to talk through the detail of the research. Linda will then talk a little bit about where we might go next on kind of economic research related to community business. And then we'll have roughly 20 to 25 minutes to dig into Q&A and have a bit of a discussion. So as we go, please do, if you've got questions or thoughts or comments, please do type them in the Q&A section. So rather than the chat, in the Q&A section, the bottom of your Zoom call with a question mark in, please do be popping thoughts in there as we go, and we'll pick those up in the kind of second half of the webinar today. So without further ado, I'll crack on and then pass to Andy and Stephen in a sec to talk through the research. So why did we commission this research? First of all, I think it's really important to say that Power to Change, an organization that's been working with community businesses for 10 years now, and have over the years done lots of different bits of work on the kind of evidence base that sits beneath community business. We know that they're powerful, important organizations in their local places, 11,000 of these community businesses across England. But one of the things that felt like the evidence base was slightly lacking was really getting into the unique economic contribution of community business, and thinking about that in several ways that I will dig into shortly. It's also fair to say that I think the importance of growth as a concept has kind of really been prominent on the political agenda in recent years. The new government has made it a really central priority for them. Local and combined authorities have been in the process of devising and developing local growth plans. And we think community business is a really central part of this kind of growth debate. And part of the kind of rationale for this work was to really put some evidence behind some of those assertions that we make and ensure that everyone engaging in that debate can see the role that community business can play in driving important local, social, inclusive growth. And so what we were aiming for this work was to try and put some numbers onto some of this stuff. So both at the national level, so thinking about those 11,000 community businesses that exist across England, and thinking what does that look like in growth terms nationally, and really trying to speak in some of the language that stakeholders in places like the Treasury know and understand, and we'll need to be able to speak in those ways to ensure that community business is taken seriously by some of those stakeholders. But also really wanted to dig into the local economic impact of community businesses. I think anyone that knows community business knows that it's so much more than contribution to national growth. It's the local supply chains that they employ, for example, the way that they employ people furthest from the labour market or employ local people more broadly. So really trying to dig into that unique local economic impact of community business, as well as thinking about them in aggregate at the national level. And then importantly as well, so it's the community and the business that's important. And we wanted to really dig into that kind of community value that community businesses provide and think about that in economic terms. So how might the role of community businesses have an economic impact in terms of pounds saved on health spending because of their preventative role, or the role that community businesses play in bringing people together and connecting them, and again, trying to think about some of those things in economic terms. And fundamentally, I think all of this, just to kind of loop back around to that big picture around growth and it being a government agenda at the moment, we see this as really central to helping lots of different people make the case for community business. So Power to Change trying to use this work to make the case for community business at a national level. But hopefully, and one of the things that I hope we can get into today and get some questions from community business leaders on this, is that this can be useful for community businesses themselves. So if you're making the case to a local authority for investment, or to a funder or investor that a community business is the sort of thing that they should be supporting, we hope that this economic contribution research can help you do that. So that's the kind of rationale for the work. I will leave it there for now and pass to Andrew, Andy, and Stephen to talk us through what we found.
Thank you, Nick. I'm Andrew Graves from Altus Economic Research, based up in Newcastle. My colleague Andy Rowell and our partner in this research, Stephen Miller. I'm going to take you through the majority of the presentation and ask Stephen to make a couple of contributions around community impacts and local impacts. And we're all here to field questions from you later on, and I hope you have can come up with some good ones. So first of all, from us, thanks very much for spending some time on this webinar today. I hope to communicate what we've done and some of the value of it, and look forward to discussing a bit later. First of all, if there is anybody, and there might be, on the call who's directly contributed to this work, and I'll tell you about how that might have happened in a minute, then thank you very much. But also a sort of global thanks to everybody and colleagues at Power to Change. The structure of this presentation, if you could just go on to the next slide, please, Louisa, is really just to run you through, what we've done, how we went about doing it, some of the constraints and limitations, and then to walk through our main quantitative and qualitative findings, because the report does present numbers, but also explains how community businesses make the contributions that we cover, and gives really good case studies and examples. And then just touch on some of the challenges and opportunities which came up in the discussions when we were running the research, and just a final slide on how you might use some of this work in practice. Thank you. Next slide, please. So just quickly, the report obviously presents the detail of our methodology, and the sort of trickiest bit is the last point on this slide here. Because as Nick explained, the key goal here was to quantify the economic contribution of community businesses to the English economy for the first time. Now, there have been, sort of major moves forward in terms of methodologies and approaches for doing that kind of thing, but there are still some big limitations. So anyone who's familiar with the Green Book, for example, which is the Treasury sort of Bible on doing a lot of this stuff, recent amendments to that include a lot of stuff around social value, but the mechanisms and techniques to quantifying some of that, which is incredibly important to the community business, are still quite limited. But I'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a moment. Broadly speaking, literature review, quite a sort of classic methodology really. Literature review, what do we know? what's already been published. Um, qualitative discussions with 29 community businesses across the country, different themes, different focus of those businesses, different locations. Um, Drawing out evidence for case studies and also drawing on materials that community businesses provided to us and other reports and so on for those case studies. And then the big effort really was around quantitative analysis and modelling. Now, just very briefly, our initial starting point was art of the possible. What can we map? You know, if we map economic and social contributions from community businesses, what does that look like? And then we tested the feasibility of quantifying those different aspects of contribution. And unfortunately, quite a few of those which we would have liked to have explored, we weren't able to because of a lack of data. But the core methodology uses power to changes work to estimate the total size of the population of community businesses. And let's not forget, this is a subset of the wider voluntary and community sector. It used data from the last year's Community Business Market Survey around jobs and volunteers and so on. And then it drew in from a wide range of sources other secondary data that we used to scale and quantify different impacts. Okay, uh, thank you. Next slide, please. That's all I'll say on method. Okay, over to Stephen, please, just to introduce some of these community impacts.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so I think as Andrew sort of highlighted, the research looked at a sort of broad range of ways in which community businesses contribute to the economy, both at sort of national and local levels. Although not all of which we've been able to quantify. But I wanted to talk about sort of seven in particular. So the first thing that we saw was that community businesses are deeply embedded in the local communities and address a range of local needs. So, for example, we saw one community business who had transformed their local area by refurbishing housing and providing affordable housing alongside education and employment opportunities. And that's just one example, really, of how community businesses are impacting on their local economies and labour markets through job creation, creating volunteering opportunities, as well as providing training and skills development opportunities. And we have been able to quantify some of those impacts, and Andrew's going to talk about that shortly. We also saw how community businesses support inclusive growth by addressing the needs of disadvantaged communities. Often economists think of inclusive growth as the additional benefits that businesses can create or contribute in terms of health and well-being improvements, for example. And we saw lots of examples of community businesses providing therapeutic or educational benefits through the services, whether that's providing training or access to wellness activities, or if it's supporting local tourism or working to support rural economies. We also saw how community businesses contribute to sustainable growth by generating renewable energy and reducing energy costs for local organisations. And that in turn supports local jobs as well as providing training and development opportunities. And other research conducted by Community Energy England shows that the community energy projects across the country are generating an estimated 43 million in turnover in 2023, of which 12.9 million has been reinvested back into those communities. So again, it sort of presents a different way of doing business. A lot of community businesses are investing in regenerating local heritage buildings and community assets. And there are numerous examples in the report of that. And you can see how community businesses are transforming derelict buildings and creating vibrant community spaces instead, and how that in turn is supporting other local businesses as well as creating jobs. And there's an estimated 6,300 community-owned assets across the country, and they're contributing nearly 220 million per annum to the UK economy. About 1 in 4 community businesses is operating on or near a local high street. So they're playing a crucial role in regeneration there as well by increasing footfall, again, creating jobs, but also helping to foster civic pride and create vibrant community spaces and hubs where people can meet and connect with their friends and neighbours. We saw how many communities were taking charge of taking charge in terms of addressing local housing shortages. And so there's lots of community led housing initiatives that are addressing housing shortages by providing affordable, sustainable homes. And community land trusts are just one example. Provided in the report, which show how community businesses develop and manage housing projects that prioritise quality, affordability, and sustainability. And we've been able to quantify some of those impacts as well, which again, Andrew will sort of talk about shortly. And then finally, lots of community businesses are actively working towards net zero goals by improving energy efficiency, reducing waste, sourcing locally, as well as embedding sustainability into their core operations. And this is despite sort of challenges with older buildings, maybe a lack of or limited public transport locally. And really we saw how their efforts sort of demonstrate a very strong commitment to environmental sustainability. So they're just some of the sort of community impacts that we observed through the research. And if we move to the next slide, I'll hand over to Andrew.
You're on mute, Andrew.
Classic. Thank you. Yeah, so this is before talking about local and community impacts or some of the quantification we've been able to do, I just want to talk you through the sort of headlines on national impact, on national economic contribution. So some of you who have some experience of this kind of work will know that when we economists do impact work, we attempt to estimate the total impact of an initiative, of a group of organisations, etc., through three mechanisms. One is the direct contribution to gross value added that they produce through the jobs and the operations that they run. The second is indirect gross value added, which is the economic output stimulated by their spend in the supply chain. And the third is economic output, which is stimulated through expenditure, which is driven by the salaries that are paid. Okay, so that's your direct, indirect, and induce elements of the impact. And what we found when we estimated, right. I don't know what quite happened there, but I'll carry on. I'm sure the slides will come back up. I can't see them at the moment. Here we go. So what we found was when we consider the scale of the population of community businesses and the output produced by employees and others working in those businesses, we estimate the total direct economic contribution to be 1.5 billion. But when we look at the total contribution, including direct and indirect, that grows to 5.8 billion in England. Now, this is about half of the economic contribution of, for example, agriculture, forestry, and fishing. So it's not an insignificant amount of money. It's about 0.3% of economic output for England. And of course, as I said earlier on, we're talking about community businesses as a subset of the wider voluntary and community sector. What we also found, and this is driven in part by the survey work that was done last year, Community Business Market Survey, was that the sector employs about 41,800 employees, of which 1 in 5, 21%, were previously unemployed. And that in itself, I think, demonstrates the very crucial role that community businesses play in bridging the gap between worklessness and work, and providing routes into the labour market for a large number of people. And of course, volunteering is often on that pathway as well. And we found that across the 11,000 businesses, there's 126,200 volunteers giving their time for free. Some of the work we did to estimate social value suggested that the social value of recruiting people that were previously unemployed is worth around 95 million to the English economy, whilst the social value of recruiting people to more secure jobs is worth 42 million. So you can see how other economic contributions are delivered by the operations and activities of social businesses. And we also estimate that for volunteers, the sort of substitutional economic contribution of volunteers, in other words, the output they would produce if paid is around 90 million, whereas the social value of that volunteering activities is around 470. So, you're looking at very sizable additional social impacts driven by the way that community businesses operate, the sort of people they employ, and the scale of volunteering opportunities that they provide. The other important thing to say is that, coming back to this point about us being unable to fully expound all of the different routes to social impact and not being able to quantify them, but Power to Change's estimates are that the social value contribute of community business is up to 9 times their direct economic contribution. Okay, so it's really important to recognise that these are very sizable social impacts, only some of which we're able to quantify at all. Okay, next slide, please. Just a couple of things in addition to this. So we looked at productivity, gross value added per job, and that came out about 36,000, which is just over half of the average floor jobs in England. But it is very close to the level of other sectors such as health and social care, and also above that of the wider voluntary sector, which is 18,700. So, and obviously we taking on board the comments I just made about us, this being a sort of minimum estimate, because the social values are not fully included, unfortunately, because not possible to do that. Then we can see that actually the likelihood is that these figures will be considerably higher. The other thing we looked at, and the first comment here is based on examining some work to evaluate the Empowering Places programme, which Power to Change funded a little while back. And the second one, looking at Power to Change's data on leveraging funding, is that for every pound that is produced by is invested in community businesses, there's evidence to suggest that that produces up to £6 of economic contribution. So 6 to 1 benefit cost ratio when looking at programs which invest money and provide support to community businesses for them to grow and scale up. And then, as a result of receiving investment, for example, from Power to Change, the evidence suggests that a significant amount of additional funding is then leveraged in, and Power to Change's data suggests this is around £4.68 per pound of Power to Change investment. So it's not just money for money's sake and the good that it does, it's the fact that it unlocks a very significant additional investment by others into these activities. So these processes are incredibly important. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to sort of walk through every one of these lines. They're there for you all to read. But this slide just summarises a few of the other sort of local economic contributions and impacts that we found in the study. And then I'm going to hand over in a moment to Stephen, who's going to talk through, the mechanisms and the approaches that deliver these things. Some of these are potentially useful benchmarks for you and others to take away and to use in your work. But I did want to just make a couple of comments about formal training, because community businesses are extremely active in providing formal and informal training to their staff and volunteers. We found that about 65% of all employees in community businesses have received some sort of formal training in the last year, and 84% have received some sort of informal training. So coupled with the goal of or their ability to draw people forward who might be distanced from the labour market, you can see that there's a very important role being played here on upskilling as well, and building confidence and so on and so forth. And for volunteers, just under a third have received some sort of formal training, and nearly a half some sort of informal training. Okay, so hopefully the report, if you get to read it in full, will give you a really rich view of not just what some of the quantitative benefits and impacts contributions are here, but also how they happen and how important they are to address, some really quite entrenched social and economic issues. So I'm just going to hand over to Stephen to talk through some examples, please.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so we, as Andrew said, we interviewed quite a lot of community businesses as part of the research, and there's lots of case studies in the report. But I think a sort of good example that illustrates the added value that community businesses contribute to the local economy is sort of what's happening in Anfield in Liverpool. And for those who aren't familiar with the area, for many years this sort of neighbourhood was facing a period of decline with abandoned streets left behind by a failed government regeneration plan. But it was a project in 2010 when an artist asked local residents, invited local residents to reimagine the area, asking them, what does it mean to live well? And in response to that question, locals came forward and formed the Home Baked Community Land Trust, and they renovated a derelict bakery opposite Liverpool Football Club and converted the ground floor into commercial space, and then the upstairs into affordable housing. And although the subsequent housing plans didn't materialise for a range of different reasons, the Community Land Trust then pivoted to a number of other neighbourhood-wide initiatives, and includes things such as the Cozy Club, which helps residents slash their energy bills through insulation and draft proofing. They have the Neighbourhood as Incubator programme, which pairs would-be entrepreneurs locally with mentors. And then they've also convened the Anfield Improvement District, helping high street traders collaborate with each other rather than competing. And as one of the interviewees put it in this quote at the top here, as a community land trust, our work is generational. It's not just a 12-month project, it's about changing how development happens in our neighbourhood. Out of that project then span Home Baked Bakery, which span out as an independent business in 2012. And not only do they sell pies to Liverpool Football Club on match days, but they also cater for lots of other organisations across Liverpool. And the profit from that commercial activity is then used to subsidise their offer to their local community, and that includes providing cheaper meals for local nurseries as well as pensioner lunches. And the bakery also employs differential pricing, and it charges higher prices on match days and uses the profits to subsidise local offerings in the neighbourhood. And being open regularly and carefully managing how the profits are used also means the bakery is then able to achieve its other two main aims, which are about providing good quality jobs, as well as providing training for the local community. In addition to sort of creating jobs and catering for local residents, the bakery also sources its ingredients from nearby suppliers, which is having the effect of reinforcing a hyperlocal economy. So, as a second quote here shows, we buy meat from the local butcher, we buy flour from the baker, which is also a cooperative. We buy all of our fruit and veg from a local fruit and veg supplier. We buy our pie cases from a local supplier. All of these are within 2 or 3 kilometres of the bakery, so it reinforces local economic activity. And then finally, just a few streets away is Kitty's Laundrette, which provides affordable, environmentally friendly laundry services. But they also host a range of other activities within the laundrette, from knitting clubs to film nights, creating a space where people can connect with their neighbours and with each other, and combating social isolation in the process. And Kitty was really founded with an ambition to open up access to quality services within the local area, ensuring that people's basic needs were met, but whilst also utilising the assets that exist locally. So, for example, they partner up with the local children's centres and food banks to provide free laundry service, quality local jobs. And as the final quote here shows, one interview, he said, we run our community business with paid employees rather than volunteers, because creating good jobs is one of the ways we can support our neighbourhood. So all 10 of their employees live nearby. They earn at least a real living wage. They enjoy family-friendly hours, interest-free loans, and personal development budgets. So, as in addition to employing people furthest away from the sort of jobs market, community businesses are also creating good quality jobs as well. And so you can see how together this combination of community businesses operating within this neighborhood is helping to regenerate that neighborhood. So, it's reviving vacant buildings, it's generating and retaining wealth locally through hyperlocal supply chains, it's creating stable jobs, it's nurturing other startups, and it's also boosting community pride. And challenges obviously remain within Anfield, like many areas. But I think the progress shown there can point a way to sort of what can be achieved when communities take ownership and work together to shape their future. I think it also helps illustrate the findings from this research as well, showing just how community businesses contribute to the local economy and create other types of social value in the process as well. So this is an example of what's happening just within one area with several community businesses in that space. And I'll hand back over to Andrew, who's going to talk a bit more about some of the value that's created.
You're muted again, Andrew.
Thanks. I have 4 slides left, but conscious of time, I'm only going to speak to this one and the final one. Not because the other two are unimportant, but I think this and the last are more important. So we touched earlier on the ambition of trying to understand economic contribution at local level. Now, because of the restrictions and limitations around data, we weren't able to produce an estimate of community business economic contribution for each local authority in England, which we'd have liked to have done. So instead, we came up with this approach, which is to look at some typologies and or archetypes, as we call them in the report. And we use the ONS urban-rural definition to classify all local authorities into these 3 groups. And then we use power to changes data on grant distribution, which is a sample, albeit a little skewed, because some locations have been targeted with funding, but nonetheless, this is the data available to us to make some estimations of the distribution of economic value across local authorities within these types. What we find is that locations which are classified as predominantly urban are the largest in terms of economic contribution because they contain the highest concentrations of community businesses. What we also found, though, was that areas which are defined as predominantly rural, and by the way, very happy to share the sort of technical stuff on all this and provide a list of local authorities by these classifications if anyone's interested. But it was locations which are predominantly rural which are producing the highest economic contribution per head of population, per 100,000 resident population, which we thought was interesting. I don't think we can entirely explain it, but quite an interesting finding. And just at the bottom there, you'll see that across these 3 archetypes, we've got estimates of the average number of community businesses. This is grant recipients, though. So again, there'll be a little bit of a skew in there. But this is our approach, an approach that we were able to develop and employ in this study to fill a little bit of the gap around local economic contribution. Okay, next slide, please, Louisa. I'm not going to talk to this. We identified a few challenges and we identified a few opportunities. We talk about them in the report. Last slide, thanks very much, and then we'll finish. Okay, so last slide just on employing this research. So we thought about 2 audiences: community businesses, policymakers, whether they be in a local authority or elsewhere in a funder or a think tank. Hopefully some of the numbers and the data, and I've produced some at the bottom there, but there are others on other slides, can be used to provide you with the basis for estimates of what your community business might be producing, what your local area might have in terms of community business. And Simon Hanson, nice to see you again. We've had a conversation about this. I'll come back to you on that. The nature and scale of the kinds of contributions that community businesses are making can be sort of grossed up and estimated from some of these baselines. Okay, so if you want to explain the economic and social contribution of community businesses, if you want to quantify it to some extent, either at community business level or groups, if you want to take lessons from the report in terms of designing projects and initiatives and interventions to achieve certain goals using community businesses as the mechanism to do it, then I think there's a lot in this report for you, as well as other things, I hope. But we'll end it there. Look forward to the Q&A. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andrew, Stephen, for that presentation. I'm going to pass quickly to Linda so we can create a bit of space for Q&A. Seen a few questions and thoughts coming in. Do keep them coming whilst Linda's talking. But yeah, I'll pass to you now, Linda.
Thanks, Nick. And yeah, thank you again to Andrew and Stephen for presenting key findings of the research. And hopefully, as you can see, there are really rich findings, both in terms of the kind of key figures around GVA and return on investment, and the case studies of community businesses and their local impacts for their local communities. So we're sharing the link to the research in the chat if you haven't already seen it. But we also wanted to very briefly touch on future uses of this research and next steps. And rather than kind of treating this as a static one-off piece of foundational evidence, we actually do want this to remain live. And we're keen to make this quite valuable to and useful for kind of community businesses and policymakers. So our discussions on kind of future uses so far have led us to think about kind of several ideas that we're currently exploring. So for example, repeating this kind of exercise around calculating the economic contribution of community businesses. We're aware that this isn't a static figure and that it might change if the community sector remains stable or grows in the future. So we're aware that it would be very useful to repeat this exercise maybe every 3 to 5 years. We're also thinking that it's important to update our understanding of community businesses' social value, as we've touched on in the presentation. And our argument as throughout this piece of research is making the economic case for supporting community business, but we also know that community businesses have significant positive impacts on their local communities beyond the direct economy. So back in 2020, we did a study that showed that a comprehensive view of community businesses' economic contribution that does include social value could potentially be, 9 times higher as an estimate than our current kind of estimate shows. So we'd like to explore this and potentially update this figure. We're also wanting to look at how asset ownership might contribute to the bigger picture, particularly thinking about the sustainability of this kind of model of community ownership, the resilience of community businesses, and being able to make the economic case for kind of further supporting community ownership. And then finally, we're interested in looking at a more granular level, the different kind of models of community business. We know that a community pub isn't the same as a community hub, for example, and seeing how their economic contribution and the flow of local benefits from these different places within the sector might vary. So being able to kind of help community businesses at a more individual level. So those are just a couple of the ideas that we're discussing at the moment, but we're really open to feedback and open to different thoughts. And if you do have any kind of further ideas on what might be really useful for you in terms of utilizing this data or for next steps, then please do just let us know, slot them in the Q&A or in the chat, or reach out to us afterwards. I'll pass back to Nick now for the Q&A.
Thank you, Linda. So we've got roughly 20 minutes now, and thanks everyone for questions coming through in the chat. I'm going to kick off with a few methodology questions. So we'll come to Andrew and then Andy, Stephen, if you want to jump in, please do. And I'll do them. There's a kind of group of 3 methodology questions, which maybe you can kind of deal with together. So a question from an anonymous attendee around the figures and whether they're based on the lifetime of a community business or in an average year. So for example, the estimated total direct economic contribution per area of 377 million for rural community organisations, is that per year or over the course of the life of a community organisation? Isabel asks about whether you could elaborate a bit more on how you calculated the estimated social value figures. And then Richard carries reference National Churches Trust research on which a new tool on ways to measure the social and economic value of individual churches. So asks whether the research we're talking about today includes the contribution of faith-based, mission-aligned community businesses and social enterprises. So 3 questions there, which hopefully you guys can pick up.
Thank you. I'll kick off by answering the easy one, which is the first one. It's per annum. So we haven't considered the lifetime impact of a community business or the sector. These are annual figures. So that's the first one. On the calculated social value stuff, perhaps Andy or Stephen would like to come in.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. Yeah, so with the social value, we used Hack's social value bank tool to calculate social value associated with community business outcomes. And so within that tool, each outcome has a defined financial metric, which includes the value of wellbeing improvements, the value of health improvements, but also savings to the state as well. So we looked at where community businesses were generating the same outcomes and then maps that to those financial metrics. And often we were using some of the same data sources as Hacked as well. So the Community Life Survey, for example, which Power to Change has used and Hacked have used as well.
And then in relation to the third question about including faith-based and mission-aligned community businesses and social enterprises, we haven't specifically included them as a distinct group, but we haven't excluded them either. So essentially all businesses within the scope of Power to Change's definition of community businesses, which, excuse me, I mean, Linda and Nick will correct me here if I get this wrong, but the definition is that community businesses make a majority of their income from trading activities rather than from grant activities. So as long as a business kind of fits within that definition, it's included within the research.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, and I guess just to say that lots of this research is based on data from our community business market report, and that uses a kind of broad definition of community businesses, locally accountable, locally rooted trading, as you touch on, Andy, and providing kind of broad benefit for the wider community. We've got a few other questions in the chat. And I wonder, Linda, whether I come to you on Jack Scriven's question. So he spoke about kind of benchmarking against agriculture and forestry. And he was asking if we have any other benchmarks of the metrics versus other sectors, and makes the point, especially those that attract significant subsidy. That might be in the report, but yeah, I want to come to you on benchmarking, Linda, because I know you've done a bit of thinking about that.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, and we've Andrew kind of mentioned this in the presentation in terms of comparing the GVA figure, the total GVA figure, to the agricultural industry. And in the reader's guide that has also been linked in the chat, we've done a little bit of this comparison as well, because we know that, you might have a figure that's in isolation, but it's actually a lot more useful to be able to compare to kind of different sectors within the national economy as well. So some of the kind of figures that we have included in the reader's guide are around the total GVA. So if the total economic contribution of community businesses is 5.8 billion, which represents about 0.3% of total national GVA, then this compares to, for example, the solar industry, which contributed 1.9 billion in GVA in 2024, and the agricultural industry, which contributed about 0.6% in total national GVA in 2023. So really looking at kind of those smaller or niche sectors that are kind of experiencing kind of more growth. And then we've also looked at GVA per head. So we've said kind of GVA per employee in community business was around 36,000 in 2022. In the report, in the full report, it's cited that this is higher than food and drink manufacturing and close to the level in the health and social care sector. And then in contrast, GVA per head in the voluntary sector is around 18,705. So just a few kind of comparisons to different sectors there.
Thank you, Linda. I've got a couple of questions around kind of government understanding and government, what government could do, which I might come to you first on, Linda, and then equally Stephen, Andy, Andrew, if you want to come in, please do. So we had one anonymous question, which is really about kind of government understanding. So how does Power to Change feel the current government understand the impact community businesses make in England and their contribution to society and the economy? And then a question from Charles about what thing could government do that would have the biggest positive impact on strengthening community businesses? And then also on expanding the number of community businesses. So I think one's about strengthening existing community business, the other about expanding the number. Obviously, things like doubling the size of the cooperative economy are priority for this government and part of the Labour manifesto. So maybe come to you first, Linda, on either of those questions, and then Andy, Andrew, Stephen, if you've got thoughts, do jump in.
Thanks, Nick. And I think in terms of, sorry, I'm just looking at the anonymous attendees question. I think there is, I think one of the reasons why, and Nick, you kind of mentioned this at the start of the webinar, why we kind of wanted to do this piece of research is because of this kind of lack of evidence around there being an economic case for community business and being able to say, well, we know we're sitting on this very this bank of evidence, and we're showing the government that community business can contribute to local inclusive growth, but we don't have this kind of piece where we can say this is actually how much they're contributing to national kind of economic growth, and being able to actually say that, I think will help us to kind of make that case to the government at the moment in terms of being able to say, okay, this is the actual impact that they make, this is their contribution to the economy. I think, as you kind of said, Nick, there is this debate around local growth at the moment, and I think we're trying, we've at Power to Change, we've been using the evidence from this piece of research in kind of our arguments around local growth and being able to say, this is if you had this amount of investment in community businesses and you kind of you essentially put this investment into clusters of community businesses, this is the amount of growth that you could kind of expect to receive, or what we've estimated. So being able to we're being able to make that case to the government at the moment. I wonder whether for Andrew, Andy, or Stephen, it might be good to kind of touch on what you weren't able to touch on in the slides, which is the opportunities around opportunities and challenges.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think we had three challenges identified on that slide: funding of financial sustainability being perhaps the one on everybody's mind every day, but also the wider context of broader economic factors impinging on community businesses' abilities to grow and to be sustainable. Energy costs, etc. And operational challenges around managing older buildings, addressing antisocial behaviour. I think we have to recognise, I don't know the answer to the questions to the extent to which the national government understands this stuff. I think it is really important to recognise that community businesses are often at the forefront of tackling social, economic and social challenges of deprivation and so on, the results of deprivation and inequality, and so on. So they're actually tackling some of the most intransigent and difficult problems that we face in our society and community, which makes their performance and impact even more valuable. But the ongoing challenge of balancing financial sustainability, sourcing funding, etc. We live in a sort of public funding world at the moment, which is very pillar to post these days. It's very much central government decides there's a fund that will last for 2 or 3 years. It gets disseminated out into the regions, however, through whatever mechanism, and then everyone scrambles to receive some of that money and deliver in time. And I think I should say, just on the government side of things, we're involved in evaluating a number of UK Shared Prosperity Fund programmes around the country. And the one we're going to talk to is in the North East. So it's what used to be the North of Tyne, it's now North East Command Authority. And the 3 investment themes under that are supporting local businesses, people and skills, and community in place. And we've had a lot of comment back from the Combined Authority and partners that actually the community in place bit, perhaps not the place bit, but the community part of that feels new for those organisations. They're well set up on the business support side, well set up on people and skills, good on infrastructure, good on town centres, doing that kind of stuff within the local government world, because Combined Authorities are really just a layer on that. But the community stuff is new. So to them. So I think there's definitely some learning and appreciation needs to happen, and is happening to some extent, but maybe on the nursery slopes within those sorts of organisations. I mean, that particular Combined Authority has got some excellent people with great track record in community and social impact and so on. But as an organisation, it's learning about how to use community and voluntary sector organisations to achieve its goals. I mean, I could go through the opportunity slide, but I won't. But I don't know whether Andy or Stephen want to add to that.
All I was going to say is, I think with perhaps in the past, the sort of the case around community business has been well, I think this type of data can only help strengthen the case around community business. I think particularly in terms of the multiplier effect of if you invest £1 into a community business, it creates additional £6 in value, but also in that process demonstrating the other types of value that is created beyond just purely economic, which I think is perhaps where the conversation needs to head to next. I'll hand over to Nick.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Andrew. And just to build on the point you were making, Andrew, around the kind of other institutions like combined authorities. I see Jonathan Nunn, who we know well, has asked a question in the chat, in the Q&A, around sustained economic growth as government's #1 mission, and then reference local growth plans that combined authorities are being required to develop, and how a lot of that focus at the moment is on how growth will be developed, but not about how the benefits will be dispersed. So essentially a question around inclusive growth, I think, there. And then asked, to what extent does this work allow us to argue that community business can play a key role in this process? And I think that's something that you touched on, Andrew, and I'm going to use it to unashamedly plug some other work that Power to Change is doing at the moment, really ably led by my colleagues Jess Craig and Natalie White, which will be launching in a couple of weeks at a webinar similar to this one, our Lessons in Local Growth work, which is really drawing on 5 years experience working with strategic authorities. So combined authorities like the Liverpool City region, the North East Combined Authority, the West Midlands Combined Authority, and working with them on the ways to catalyse social economy growth. But just to Jonathan's point, particularly on the local growth plans, we've also had lots of conversations through that work with officers involved in the development of those local growth plans, and grappling with those very same challenges, Jonathan, that you highlight, about one driver from central government being particularly on the kind of growth in aggregate terms, but then also wanting to build in that kind of inclusive growth that engages the social economy. So I think my colleague has just posted a link to that event in the chat, and we'll be publishing a full paper in the next couple of weeks. So please do look out for that. I've seen one other question in the chat, which I hope we might be able to just get to quickly from Isabel, which is around further details on a breakdown of the data and results by local authority, and asking whether that level of detail is accessible. So I know, Andy, you spoke to that in your remarks, and I know, Linda, you might have some thoughts on that. So maybe, Andrew, I see you've come off mute. I'll come to you first.
Yeah, thanks. We haven't. I'm sorry, I perhaps wasn't entirely clear. This use of archetypes is to fill a gap which we were hoping to fill completely with the research, but were unable because of the nature of the data available to us, and that would have been to produce local authority level estimates of number of community businesses and the economic contribution at that scale. So across the however many hundred there are in England. The archetype thing allows us to say something about local authorities which have particular characteristics, what the average economic contribution within those places is. It doesn't speak to or it doesn't present data on the variation within that or the economic contribution for any particular local authority. What I was referring to sharing there was a table which shows you how each local authority in England is classified against the urban rural classification, so that you can say, for example, oh, Wigan is predominantly urban, or whatever it is of those three. We're in Wigan, so we're a bit like that. And we might be able to use that as an example in putting our case to whoever for funding and support. So, I mean, that data is published, it's not ours, it's ONS's classification of local authorities into those groups, but we have the spreadsheet, very happy to share it. So I think if you're interested in local authority estimates of community business economic contribution, then the route into it through this report is to identify how your local authority, the local authority you're interested in, is classified against that urban rural classification, and then use that average data for those different archetypes to come up with some estimates. That I'm afraid is as far as we've been able to go in this study. But I think it's in some ways another thing to add to Linda's list of potential. Well, in fact, it was on there of ways in which this research might be built on in the future.
Thank
So
you.
I hope that answers that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That's really clear. And just aware of time and know how busy everyone is. So thank you very much for joining. Lots for us to mull there, kind of future research ideas, ways that we can make best use of this research from an advocacy point of view, whether that's at a national level, local or regional level. So thanks everyone for the questions, thoughts. Really appreciate it. Just before wrapping up, just want to say a huge thank you to Andrew, Andy, Stephen, Linda for your contributions today. Really great. And thank you particularly to Andrew, Andy, and Stephen for all the work on the research. Really helped us kind of push the evidence base forward for community business and their economic impact. So really appreciate it. And finally, thank you to everyone for joining today. I found it a really great discussion. Do engage with all the links that the team have been sharing in the chat. Do reach out to us if you've got any other questions on the research. We'd be very happy to try and answer those. And hopefully see you at another one of these soon. I did mention the local growth event in a couple of weeks. We'll be kind of building on this discussion, so please do join us for that if you can. And I think that's it. So have a great rest of your days and see you all soon. Thank you.